In the early hours of December 16, 1944, before the glow of dawn could touch the cloudy skies, a massive artillery barrage ended the quiet in the Ardennes forest. For an hour and a half, shell explosions rattled a 75-mile front. Once the barrage finally ceased, hundreds of tanks and thousands of men began streaming through the Ardennes. Rifle and machine gun fire filled the frigid morning, joined by a chorus of tank cannons. Taking advantage of the winter weather that kept aircraft grounded, the Germans had taken the Allies completely by surprise. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and Germany was making what would be its last major offensive on the Western Front. This month-long battle was one of great confusion and chaos, and the unprepared Allies were forced to give up miles of territory. They abandoned equipment, retreated when they could, and fell or surrendered when they could not. At its most dramatic point, the front line was pushed back as far as 60 miles. Heavy snowfall and fog obscured the battlefield for days, and tanks often had to be broken out of the ice in the morning. Between the oppressive weather, the desperate fighting, and the dizzying movements of troops, it was easy for soldiers on both sides to become separated from their units. Such was the case on Christmas Eve when a handful of American and German soldiers found themselves in the same cabin in the Hurtgen forest, laying down their weapons to enjoy a Christmas meal together. We have this tale because it was recounted by Fritz Vincken, who was a 12-year-old boy at the time, but recalled the story in 1973 for Reader's Digest. The account here is informed by the article, which was titled Truce in the Forest, and is supplemented by other interviews that Fritz later gave. In the winter of 1944, Fritz lived with his mother Elizabeth in a cabin in the Hurtgen forest near the border between Belgium and Germany. Their home in the city of Aachen had been destroyed in a bombing raid, and Fritz's father had sent them 20 miles away to live in the relative safety of the cabin. Fritz's father was serving in a town fire brigade a few miles away, and they had hoped he could make it to the cabin by Christmas. However, the arrival of frigid weather and the intense fighting of the Battle of the Bulge left the cabin isolated, and it seemed likely that Fritz and his mother would spend Christmas alone. It was a surprise then when there came a knock at the door. Answering the door, Elizabeth was even more surprised to see American soldiers standing outside their home. Though they carried weapons, they didn't act aggressively, and one of them lay in the snow gravely wounded. One of them addressed Elizabeth, and even though she didn't speak English, she understood that they were asking for a place to rest. The Vinckens faced a dilemma, for if they helped the Americans, the strict German law was that they should be shot as traitors. But looking at the young soldiers and their dying comrade, Elizabeth must have known that there was a law higher than Germany's, and she invited them in. As they came inside and laid the wounded man on Fritz's bed, Elizabeth tried speaking to them in French. Luckily, one of the Americans could speak it as well, and introductions began. The French speaker, a stocky individual, was named Jim. The other, more lean soldier was Ralph, and their wounded friend was Harry. Harry had been shot in the upper leg, and his face had gone a deathly pale, so Elizabeth tore up a bedsheet to make bandages. The men explained that they had been separated from their battalion, and they had spent the last 3 days in the forest trying to find it. They were ragged and freezing, and Elizabeth sent Fritz to retrieve their rooster and 6 potatoes for a hot meal. One of my favorite parts of this story is the Vinckens had been fattening up that rooster in preparation for a later meal, and they had named it Hermann in mockery of Hermann Göring, Hitler's chubby second-in-command. Anytime I hear a story about German citizens mocking the Nazis, it makes me happy. Anyway, Hermann's time had come, and Fritz and Jim helped Elizabeth with preparing dinner while Ralph bandaged up Harry. However, their proceedings were eventually interrupted by another knock at the door. Going to answer the door, Fritz expected to see more Americans on the other side, but was stunned to see 4 German soldiers waiting. There were now a dozen ways that things could go horribly wrong, and Fritz froze like the landscape outside. Elizabeth came to the door as well, and though certainly just as terrified as Fritz at seeing their new visitors, she calmly wished them a Merry Christmas. The Germans returned the pleasantry and then explained that they had lost their regiment and were hoping to stay at the cabin to rest until morning. Elizabeth replied that that would be fine, but there were 3 other guests inside the cabin that the Germans may not be too happy to see, and she would not allow any shooting this Christmas Eve. The German corporal who was in command immediately became agitated and demanded to know if there were Americans inside. Elizabeth measured her words carefully and then responded, "Listen, You could be my sons, and so could they in there. A boy with a gunshot wound, fighting for his life, and his two friends, lost like you, and just as hungry and exhausted as you are. This one night, this Christmas night, let us forget about killing." The Germans met her words with silence, and after a few moments, Elizabeth finally clapped her hands, told the soldiers to lay their guns on the woodpile and come inside. They finally obeyed, and Elizabeth stepped inside to quickly speak with the Americans. After a moment, they too handed over their weapons, and the 7 soldiers awkwardly settled around each other in the small cabin. Not all of the Germans were named in Fritz's account, but Heinz and Willie were both described as being 16 years old, and their corporal was the oldest at 23. Elizabeth busied herself with meal preparations and directed Fritz to go get more provisions from storage. Heinz also produced a loaf of rye bread to add to the meal, and the corporal even contributed a bottle of red wine. As the evening proceeded, one of the Germans slipped on a pair of glasses and began to inspect Harry, the injured American. Speaking decent English, he explained that he had studied medicine up until a few months ago, and he assured the Americans that the bitter cold had kept Harry's wound from becoming infected, and all he needed now was some good food and rest. When dinner was finally ready, the Vinckens and the uneasy company of soldiers gathered together around the table. Elizabeth prayed for the meal, and as she said, "Come, Jesus, be our guest," Fritz noticed tears in her eyes. As he looked around the table, he saw that every soldier had glistening eyes as well. It had been a long, terrible war, and the young men that had been trying to kill each other just a few hours before, now sharing a Christmas meal together, was, in Fritz's words, a quiet miracle. Later that evening, just before midnight, Elizabeth stepped outside to watch Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and she invited everyone else to join her. For a long moment, staring silently into the night sky, American and German soldiers alike stood together not as enemies, but as fellow men. The next morning, Harry was showing signs of improvement, and a makeshift stretcher was fashioned for him from 2 poles and a tablecloth. As the 2 groups of soldiers prepared to depart, the Germans provided a map and compass for the Americans. The German corporal pointed to Jim's map and advised him to follow a creek that would take them back to the American army. When Jim asked why they shouldn't just head for the town of Monschau, the German corporal said adamantly, "No, we've taken Monschau." With this advice, the soldiers all shook hands, bid farewell to the Vinckens, and made their way to their respective lines. Though the war had not ended, it had paused for one Christmas night for a little cabin in the woods. And while we could satisfactorily wrap up the story with that, there's actually a bit more. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Fritz Vincken recalled the story for Reader's Digest in 1973. However, among other mediums, this story was also picked up by a TV show. In the 90s, Fritz submitted his tale to Unsolved Mysteries, hoping that spreading the story could lead to a reunion with the soldiers from 50 years ago. He knew that many Germans had died at the end of the war, and he wasn't expecting to be able to find any of the 4 that had been at the cabin that day. However, he thought there was a chance he could find at least one of the Americans. He could only provide sparse details about their identities, but perhaps the uniqueness of the story could be enough to locate the men. Unsolved Mysteries accepted the submission and featured it in an episode that aired twice in 1995. Despite the long odds, Fritz's efforts paid off. After the second airing, the studio received a call from a volunteer chaplain at a nursing home in Maryland. He had recognized the story as one often told by a resident at the home, a man by the name of Ralph Henry Blank. After investigating, Unsolved Mysteries found that Ralph had served in Belgium in 1944, just the right time and place to be one of the soldiers from the cabin. Fritz was put in contact with Ralph, and a few months later he flew to Maryland to see him face to face. Despite 50 years having passed, both men recognized each other, and Ralph even still had the map and compass that the Germans had given him when they parted. Ralph was 76 years old, and Fritz was 63. It was a joyous reunion that was deeply meaningful for each man. Fritz had been deeply inspired by his mother's kindness and courage those many years ago, and he was afraid that her actions might be forgotten. His fears were laid to rest when Ralph told him, "Your mother saved my life." It was proof that the quiet Christmas truce had meant as much to someone else as it had to Fritz. He later stated that he could finally die in peace, saying, "My mother's courage won't be forgotten, and it shows what goodwill will do." Just 3 years later, in 1999, Ralph Blank passed away, and Fritz followed in 2001. In a 1997 interview, Fritz claimed that he had been reunited with another of the Americans, but his name wasn't stated and I couldn't find the details of that account. Nevertheless, Fritz Vincken's story received the recognition that he had hoped it would. There was of course the Reader's Digest article, the Unsolved Mysteries episode, and various newspapers covered it in the 90s, but it was also made into a movie. In 2002, just a year after Fritz's death, the movie Silent Night was released, of which I used various scenes for this video. I actually grew up watching this movie during Christmas, and it certainly takes some Hollywood liberties, like the fact that the Vinckens can speak English. There's a scene where the wounded private almost shoots the Germans, and at the end, a German disguised as an American MP shows up to complicate everything. But otherwise, it tells the story well, and it's worth a watch. You just have to get used to Sarah Connors from Terminator playing a German housewife hiding in the woods, protecting her son, and storing weapons in the shed, trying to avoid a catastrophic war that will involve nukes. Yeah, actually, because time travel, I'm pretty sure Silent Night is just a forgotten entry in the Terminator canon, and that MP was a T-1000 trying to infiltrate the cabin. Get ready for Judgment Day, everyone. Anyway, that is the tale of the quiet miracle of the cabin in the woods right in the midst of the Battle of the Bulge. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and if you did, consider sharing it with someone who might enjoy a good World War II Christmas tale. I'm always looking for interesting World War II stories like this, so if you know of any, drop them in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruibas out.